Good afternoon. It's a great pleasure for me to wish you all welcome to this meeting in the Academy. The meeting of two cultures, archaeology meets molecular biology. That's a wonderful topic for a science academy. It's a cross-discipline topic. It's a topic about new scientific methods. It's a topic where mind meets matter and culture meets nature. Wow. I'm sure that we will have a very interesting afternoon discussing these issues. The issue of ancient DNA as a data for archaeology is really at the frontiers of knowledge. It was in 2010 that the first sequencing of, or the sequencing of the first ancient human genome took place. So it's not many years ago. We're really where it's happening at the time now. It's a new source of knowledge into the past. It's a new method of testing established theories, and it's the introduction of new, hitherto unknown data into the field of history and archaeology. But it's also an issue of competition between disciplines over claims to truth, and we see it's a new emerging discipline making claims into the field of an old and established discipline, which always is the potential for conflict and discussions. From the point of view of the old discipline, focus on genetics may imply a rekindling of old and ostracized theories of migration, ethnicity, and territory. Some claim that it may lead to a disregard of the complexity of human actions and development. And some may feel that there's a claim of precedence of a data and understandings constructed over archaeological data and cultural artifacts. We have already seen some instances of a clash between the disciplines in our Norwegian debate on the discussions on the source of ivory trade to Europe through the Viking Age and Middle Ages. Does an analysis of ancient DNA data bring anything new, has been the question. The historian, at least one historian, says no. We have already known this. But the biologists say that this has been a theory, but it has never been substantiated by data other than inferences from anecdotal evidence. The discussions show two different approaches to both the understanding of the main task of science and to the concept of novelty in science. It really goes deep into questions of the philosophy of knowledge and science. To the biologist, the concept of empirical testing of hypotheses is essential. New ways of testing theories and the possibility of falsifying alternative hypotheses is a main object of research. New clear evidence is a novelty. To the historian, testing is not that essential, and a confirmation of established theories is not a scientific novelty. So it's really a meeting of two very different cultures and approaches to knowledge. This represents positions from different traditions. Fruitful science emerges from the clash between different minds and different traditions. The humanities are used to a situation where mutually incompatible schools of thought exist side by side. Constructivism versus empiricism, for example, in the social sciences. Both exist as disciplines of science. They don't recognize each other, but they're both recognized as scientific approaches to society. To natural sciences, this is an intolerable situation, other than in the time of paradigmatic revolutions in the understanding of Kuhn. What will emerge from the meeting of archaeology and molecular biology? A new discipline? The development of different schools, or a scientific revolution? Well, we might come closer to the answer here tonight. So I give the word to Professor Kristian, or Erik Boye, perhaps, who will introduce Kristiansen.
Erik Boye, I've organized this meeting together with Anders Burkland. And I'm happy to see so many people here to discuss this important subject. It might be worth to mention that Anne and I came into this maybe the same way, but not really in a planned way. I think it's fair to say that we are both novices in archaeology and history, to say the least. So we're sorry if we have insulted anyone on our way when we have published some material on this. And I must say that the point was to provoke some of you guys to come here, and I'm glad I've succeeded at least a little bit. Yeah, for both Anne and myself, the whole thing started with reading Karin Boy's book entitled My European Family, the last 54,000 years. The book is about migration into Europe from the East, and how genomic sequencing brought new information about the spreading of people and culture. The more we read about the subject, the more interested we got, and it ended up as a subject for the Academy. Like our president underlined here, this is an ideal subject for the Academy because it encompasses almost all the groups that we have represented. To enlighten us for this meeting, we have collected a group of 3 excellent scientists. First, we would like to welcome Kristiansen. He received his PhD degree in archaeology from Aarhus University in 1975, so he's Danish. For many years, he served as the director of the Danish Archaeological Heritage Administration, and he's now professor of archaeology and department chair at the University of Gothenburg. Kristian is an expert in the movement of people, objects, animals, and ideas, especially during the Bronze Age in Europe. It's fair to say that Kristian is a prominent figure both on the international scene of archaeology, and I should mention that Kristian has been knighted, so we have a knight amongst us. He's been knighted by Dronning Margrethe for reorganizing the Danish archaeological heritage. Thank you for coming here. We appreciate this a lot. The floor is yours. And the title of his talk is The Third Science Revolution and Its Possible Consequences in Archaeology. Please.
We have been through what I have called in an earlier work the third science revolution. I'll come back to that in a moment. But basically, the genetic revolution that we saw happen in 2010 has changed the whole foundation of our understanding of the past. And that's what I'm going to talk about. I also have to say that my own background for doing this is that I started working together with geneticists when I applied for a big European grant in 2010 or 11, where I met Eske Willerslev in Copenhagen and invited him on board because I knew there was this breakthrough. So I have been working with the Copenhagen group ever since and still do. So this is work in progress, and things may even change also in the future. We are in the middle of the third science revolution. There's more to come. So there will be chances to come back here in a few years' time and tell what has happened next. I call it the third science revolution for the reason that I suggest we have had 2 before. And science revolutions are periods where science and archaeology has gone together and joined forces and created something radically new. The first time it happened was what we can call the Darwinian Revolution between 1850 and 60, when zoology, geology, and archaeology collaborated and was able to show that there was a prehistory beyond the Bible. That was truly a revolution, and it created the discipline of archaeology as a scientific discipline, along with the other disciplines. The second time it happened was here around 1950, when we got the C14, carbon-14 revolution. Suddenly, you could do, a dream came through, you could date absolutely. And before that time, most of the datings of early Stone Age culture had been guesswork. We have written sources back to perhaps 2000, 1500 BC. Beyond that, we have to calculate. And then came C14, and it turned out that our calculations had been so wrong. That was a shock, but also an inspiration, because you had to rewrite prehistory in the light of this new knowledge. And now we are in the middle of a third science revolution that in the same way has totally undermined what we believed in a surprising way. And we are now starting also to rewrite prehistory for the second time or third time. But what is the good thing about it is also, and that's the strength of collaboration between humanities and science, that you convert relative knowledge into absolute knowledge. And the benefit of being able to do that was very clear with the C14 revolution. Before the C14 revolution, most of the intellectual labor of archaeologists went into dating, finding ways to relatively date the different periods. There was very little time left to think about interpretation and history. Once you had C14, you freed a lot of intellectual space to think about more interesting questions about society, economy, and things like that. So there was a huge leap forward from the 1960s onwards till today, where we got to know a lot more about the way societies worked in the past. Now, with the DNA revolution, the same thing happens. There are things we have debated for 150 years without never really agreeing. Now we can put them aside because now we know. Now we have converted relative knowledge to absolute knowledge, and again intellectual space is freed for us to ask more interesting questions, such as why and how do migrations happen? So in that sense, it's also, these revolutions are truly productive in an academic sense and deepen our understanding. What I'm going to talk about are three turning points in prehistory. The farming transformation, the pastoral transformation, and the Metal Age transformation. And each of them are linked to various forms of mobility migrations. But let me be clear here from the very beginning. Migration is a general concept about mobility. There are many different forms of migrations, not only one type. And we'll see that in a moment. Also, there are various things that may lead to transformations. I cannot, in this brief presentation where I prefer to present you a grand narrative rather than going very deep into a single story, I cannot deal with all of them. So there are things I don't talk about. It doesn't mean that I don't know about them or they could be important. But I have selected what I think is the more interesting things right now. But diet and health, demography, disease environment, ecology, environmental change, they all contribute to change. And still today, what we don't know really yet is the balance between them. We are working to establish that balance. Also, what happened here with the first transformation was a true colonization of Anatolian farmers. There was a big climate change at that time, around 6,000, that forced farmers to move on to find new territories to survive. And they went first into the Balkans, Greece, the Balkans. And you had an incredibly rapid increase in demography due to foodstuffs were more readily available, and you can store foodstuffs. And there's a real change of diet, which is also, from a biological evolutionary point of view, a very interesting thing, because what does that lead to in terms of mutations and inherited diseases? Another big question that I will not go into tonight. But the interesting thing is that this colonizing population, they kept for themselves. They didn't admix or had sex with hunter-gatherers. They retained their gene pool because there were whole communities that migrated. So in a way, we have two parallel lifestyles in Europe coexisting for several thousand years, which is in itself an interesting story. We also see, of course, the development of new diseases when people and animals are close together. So here we have the first big migration of farming into Europe, which took place after 6000 in the 6th century and into the mid-4th century. Then it began to expand. It had reached the limit of its carrying capacity. But that second chapter I will not go into. So Northern Europe and Scandinavia came late, and that story is still being worked on genetically. So that'll be for another time. But there is a big change taking place in Hungary around this time. The farmers move up through the Balkans, and then they stop. Why do they stop there? Because they reach the ecological barriers of their lifestyle. They lived in tells, kind of semi-urban settlements. They lived in clay-built houses. They were adapted to warm climate without lots of rain. And they reached simply the climatic border of that economy and the way of life. So either they had to stop, or they had to reinvent themselves. So some of them went up north to Romania and further up, and they could more or less retain the old lifestyle. But others went into the colder and more rainy temperate Europe, and they found out timber houses are better and smaller groups. So they transformed themselves, started building huge timber houses, long houses, and adapting to a new climate, and became very successful. These people were truly farmers also in a cultural and civilizational sense. It's very clear that they had deliberately avoided hunting and game. That was below their level. They were clearly the civilized people who didn't intermix with these lower hunter-gatherers eating those wild animals. The right civilized way of living was to eat, bread and muesli, grain food. And they did. Only the poor households we can show now had to supply their meals with some game. In a way, it was a lot healthier. Because these people, over the time, they had deteriorating health. They got terribly bad teeth. So that very one-sided cereal diet wasn't really, in the long run, very healthy. They had some milk or milk products and some meat, but it was mainly based on cereals. There was a very rapid increase of populations at the time, and once they had filled up the territory of the good soils, demographic pressure led to competition over land, and soon we see massacres, competition, warfare. Here's one of them. And basically, what we witness here and is a pattern that was to continue throughout the millennia. There are two types of massacres. One where you extend a whole community because you want to take over their village and their fields, their land. So you get rid of all of them. The other type is where you only kill the males and you go away with the women. I'll come back to that. But that pattern we see already here from the beginning. Once there started being competition between groups. This is also when they for the first time start to interbreed with hunter-gatherers, because they need it. And they need their knowledge when they're going to expand further out into the deep forest of unknown territories. So the story of this Neolithic revolution is one of rise and decline. as it often happens. In the beginning, it was a big advantage, and people raised their stature, males and females. But over time, stature declined, which is a very clear indication that their diet was not the best in the world. And then we see here suddenly, woo, it goes up. Why does it suddenly raise significantly around 3,000 in the 3rd millennium BC? The reason is another economic transformation, another big change of diet. But first we have to have a little prelude to that transformation, because it transformed in Neolithic societies, more or less disappeared in the process. How was it possible that these, except that they were not the most healthy people in the world, but then still, they lived in huge societies that were very well organized. Some of them lived in mega settlements of 10, 15,000 people in Ukraine, like here. These are houses, highly organized. This is from Iberia a little bit later. So these were highly organized. But what we see here, we have colleagues who have calculated 10,000 of C14 dates over time, and there you get the rise and fall of the Neolithic populations. Because what you see here is Neolithic coming in here, the rise here of activities and populations, then you see a mysterious decline here. This is Northern Europe. There are similar graphs for all of Western Europe. All over temperate Europe, there's a mysterious decline in the 4th millennium, mid to late 4th millennium. In most regions, a few regions, they escape it. And some regions, like here in Kujava, is steep decline. What happened? Something mysterious happened here that decimated activities and populations. The answer is the plague. The plague is 5,000 years old, not 1,000 years old. Something we have documented 4 years ago for the first time. And we had the hypothesis at the time. At that time, we could show the steppe populations, the pastoral groups I'm going to talk about in a minute. They carried the plague, and the plague spread from Altai in the east to the Baltic in the west. And we had the hypothesis that the plague traveled before the migrations and killed off people, like in America, and opened a window of opportunity to go in and settle. But we hadn't proved it until now. This is a paper we published last year, where we demonstrated the mother of all plague, we found in a passage grave, a megalith in western Sweden, with 60 people buried within a very, very short period of time in one generation. And we have analyzed now 3 individuals and found the plague, the earliest form. All later plague, or Black Death as it's called in historic times, are linked to that one form, can be traced back to that one form. When did it happen? That mutation that created plague, we can say, based on the evolutionary clock, must have taken place no later than 3,700 BC. Where did it take place? Most likely in an environment where many humans and animals are together. There's a lot of garbage, and mutations can take place. Here is a passage grave with all the burials. We are now analyzing the other 50 burials and many other places. But here is our model of what we think was the origin of the plague in these big mega settlements in Ukraine, where you had 10, 15,000 people living with animals and garbage and rodents, and we know plague live with rodents. This is a hypothesis that started there, but we need hypotheses to go out and look for evidence. And we'll see in a few years' time if this is the right scenario. But it reached Scandinavia around 3000 BC. And very soon it created new strains, diverged and mutated again and spread rapidly over all of Western Eurasia. And into the Bronze Age, it became bubonic, a new mutation. Here we have the different places we have analyzed all over Western Eurasia. What we can show is if we compare to the Black Death, there are many similarities. The Black Death started with one variant of plague that spread very rapidly over a wide region. Then there were several new outbreaks where there were new strains, new mutations, and gradually over time it became less and less and people became immune. So after 400 years it more or less died out. It's not of course gone, we still have the plague. But the same thing happened here in the third millennium. You have new strains developing, spreading out. So it must have been quite virulent since it developed new strains several times. And what happened after the plague? Well, at that time, we had seen the formation of the first nomads in the steppe lands of present-day Russia and Ukraine. They started out, they're called Yamnaya. They exploited the invention of wheel and wagon. Suddenly you had mobile homes, you could move around with your animals in the steppe and let them graze and water in the rivers seasonally. Suddenly the steppe became a huge economic potential that had not existed before. And in a few very short time there was an incredible population explosion. An explosion of animals and cattle. 80% cattle, I think it is in most places. And they needed a lot of land, and once the Neolithic population started to die of the plague, it opened a window of opportunity that they exploited and moved west. We demonstrated that in a paper in 2015, along with another one from our competing group at Harvard. And we came to similar result, which was good. And therefore it was published back-to-back in Nature. In the same, the editor was wise enough to say we want to publish them back-to-back. And that had, and there we showed that there were these migrations taking place from the Russian steppe into Europe, temperate Europe, and there was a very, very rapid genetic admixture process or replacement process where Anatolian farmer DNA nearly disappeared and was heavily reduced and replaced by steppe DNA. And here is one of the illustrations we published that shows the migrations, and it created a new culture here called where? From the Yamnaya. So in a way, there is a good reason why archaeologists could be mistaken, because on the surface it looked like two different kind of material cultures. But if you had looked a little deeper into the burial ritual, and then you would have realized that they have the same burial ritual. And burial ritual is the most central institution in all societies. And that links them together. And I think Martin agrees on that. So here they created a new culture. But why did they create a new culture once they had migrated? That has to do with also what happens when people settle. But the diet and the lifestyle they brought with them was a revolution again. They lived on a diet of milk products and meat and blood. No bread and muesli. They were not farmers in the steppe. They started to learn farming once they arrived in Europe. And the question is how? They had a very healthy lifestyle because they moved around with their animals. So they became tall and healthy. And actually there is a gene for tallness that we have inherited from these people. All tall people can go back to that gene. Once they were in Europe and had settled, they continued westward and they didn't stop until they reached the Atlantic in Ireland. The same genetic mixture the same, but then they took on another culture again, we call the beaker culture. So they transformed themselves along the way by adapting to local conditions very successfully. And once they reached the English Channel, they stopped because they had reached the limit of their environment. These were pastoral people. They didn't know how to sail, but they learned it from people coming up from Iberia with maritime skills, and they took over their knowledge, smart people, and they set over the channel, and they settled in England, Scotland, Ireland, and in 300-400 years, all the Neolithic people were gone. Here we have from that article that came, was it 2 years, 1.5 years ago? This is the only time all the labs have worked together to solve a big problem. Normally we compete, but here we pulled all our samples in one big bag to be able to write that final story of how they expand the whole expansion westwards. And this obviously also represents an expansion of early Indo-European languages, and in that way solved a very old dispute. What later became Germanic was those who went north. We don't know what language they spoke when they went north, but it later became Germanic. And in Central Europe, Italo-Celtic, and in the Baltic and west of the Urals, what later became Baltic Indo-Iranian. But that's another story. Now, we have this puzzle, or we can call it the elephant in the room. How was it possible, not only that these decentralized steppe pastoralists could wipe out these well-organized Neolithic societies? Yes, the plague helped. But once they settled and started to adopt some farming, what happened was that all Neolithic male lines, they died out. Neolithic female lines continues and is still with us. The male lines disappeared. Nearly all European males, we share two male lines, R1b and R1a, which started to dominate here. How is that possible? There was a paper some years ago that showed there was this enormous decline of male lines globally. Sometime they couldn't say, they hypothesized when it was, but around the 5th, 4th millennium BC, an incredibly huge decline in male lines globally. And a group of young researchers 1 year ago or 2 years ago proposed increased male competition, where you wipe out other male lines, you could call the Genghis Khan effect, like Genghis Khan has 50 million linked to his line, so it's not an unknown phenomenon. But you see the female lines, they can go on and expand. Something very, very dramatic happens here. And it has something to do with also the way that the mobility takes place. Here we have the farming colonization. Here's a paper that shows how many women and male and females took place. The farming migration was a true colonization of whole communities, of family groups, women and men. But the steppe migrations, the nomads from the steppe, they were dominantly males. They didn't bring the women, which meant that they had to get women from other places. So here's a model we published a few years ago, that these male groups, and we know about these male groups, and why they expanded from Indo-European literature as well, because you have primogeniture in Indo-European speaking societies. Older son inherit, all other sons have to go out and make their own career, which creates an enormous social drive, and they're trained as warriors and herders and so on when they're teenagers, and then they go out And they needed women, so they marry in Neolithic women. We could demonstrate that in a paper 2 years ago when we analyzed some cemeteries of these court-wear people, and we could show that they had, most of the women were non-local, coming in from the outside, and most of them had a Neolithic diet in their childhood. So they came from still existing Neolithic settlements, probably abducted. I go over that one, and so it raised the question, what was the nature of these migrations? Well, we tend, and I do here too, tend to stress that such migrations were also full of conflict and competition. They were. I'm sure there were also daily life had to go on, but there were massacres, like this one of a Neolithic group that had been massacred probably by court-wear people, published recently. But also court-wear people could sometimes be massacred by Neolithic groups, like this one from Eulau. And they were buried in small family groups here, and both DNA and strontium could show that they were fathers and mothers and children. But the strontium showed that the women were non-local and come from a Neolithic group 60 kilometers away. They had probably been abducted because the arrows of those who killed them were not court-wear. They came from that Neolithic group. So they were the killers coming back taking revenge. So there were hostile relations, at least during periods of time. And that makes sense when we look at ethnographic and historic sources. This is a recent book about captives and the role of people, stolen people, where this Kathy Cameron shows that she goes through a whole series of societies, pre-state societies, and she demonstrates in all of them, without exception, raiding for women is a very important activity. You raid outside your own ethnic group, and you bring them in for labor and reproduction. Then their children can become part of society. She also shows, interestingly, that these women often bring new ideas, invention into these societies. So in a way, it also has a very productive side to it. Like the Neolithic women, they brought knowledge of farming to these steppe people when they migrated, and they learned how to farm. And when a colleague of mine, Gus Kronen, could show that these words for crops were non-Indo-European. They were brought in by these women. So they brought new skills. But 10 to 35% of the populations were captives. So this is the darker side of history. Now I shall, if I have time, how much time have I? 5 minutes? Let's go to then briefly the Bronze Age, because the first migrations were colonizations of whole communities. That was a farming transformation. The second one was a more warlike, male-dominated steppe pastoral migrations. And that was the steppe meat-milk transformation. And lactose tolerance started here, actually. That's another mutation that was a result of that adaptation to that lifestyle. So the fact that we can digest milk goes back to that second transformation. And that was, in a way, the age of migration, the third millennium. All of Europe became transformed, and we are still deeply influenced by that, genetically, at least. The second millennium is the Bronze Age. It's again a different form of mobility. Now it's not major migrations. They also exist. But now it's more smaller groups of people who travel. warriors, traders, both male and females. So it's a complex society, but it's a society that's so well organized that you don't need to migrate. There are organized ways of moving. And there was another thing that happened here in the Bronze Age. We see an enormous population explosion. Populations in Europe nearly doubled between 2000 and 1500 BC. So this is Europe going up here to 13 million people. This is the Near East going down because they apparently had some big epidemics and couldn't cope with climate change or whatever it was. So Europe actually had the same level of population as the Near East, but spread out. And here again, we had a new wool economy. People could dress more healthy. You didn't have wool and textiles until after 2000 BC. We had new food treatment. You could salt and smoke meat. You could carry it on your travels. So the exchange of genes continued, but it was a very different society, much more complex. And we call it the first globalization in world history. It's my colleague Helle Vankil who has made that map. This is the Bronze Age economy from China to Ireland. They were all part of trade networks. It was a truly globalized economy. Everyone needed copper and tin, and it was produced only in a handful of mines. Tin, at least, only in 3-4 mines, had to be distributed thousands of kilometers. Copper only in a handful of mines in Europe, had to be distributed hundreds of kilometers. Every settlement needed it. It was like gas and oil today. Therefore, you had to find ways of exchange and travels in a peaceful way. Therefore, warriors became important to protect the trade, sometimes disrupt it. And all of Europe were linked together in a kind of nearly sort of semi-modern economy where each region had something to bring to the table. Every region depended on each other because they had something the other regions needed. So commercial trade started here. I mean truly commercial trade, bulk trade, huge quantities, huge caravans, shipments, a regional division of labor. But also we had in the beginning some migrations because, as I told you, in Asia, in the third millennium they had all gone west. Now they go east. We could demonstrate that as well at that time in 2015, that now quartered where European people suddenly start moving west into Central Asia and later into Pakistan and India. They go the whole way over to China, Xinjiang. And it's all based on a new invention in warfare, the chariot. This is a new form of conquest where you control territories, you control mines, you control trade. This is where the Silk Road starts. Now the control of trade is important. And they spread out and expand eastwards, but the chariot spreads all over the known world, even to Egypt. And it's a very smart and light construction. You can easily assemble it and disassemble it, weight like 25 kilos. You bring it to the battlefield and you assemble it, and it's a firing platform. And the result is that we have incredible similarities from China to Scandinavia. Here we have two pieces of dress, one from Tarim in Xinjiang, Western China, and one from Egtved in Jutland, both from around 1400 BC. Same religions in those regions, and languages were very related. Indo-Iranian was a language that spread east. to India and Iran. In the Aegean, we see the arrival also of steppe people with Greek. And in Italy, we see also the arrival, Celto-Italic probably. So we are on our way to rewrite prehistory, at least in Western Eurasia. In many respects, the new results echo earlier interpretations of a generation earlier than the present one. Gordon Child, Marie Gimbutas had such big scenarios of migrations. And more of it was right than we have recognized over the last 40, 50 years. But now we can provide detail. Now we can provide institutions. Now we can provide kinship. Now we can provide models of how society functioned in detail. They couldn't do that, and therefore it tended to become simplified. But obviously it's a more dramatic prehistory than we're used to. And perhaps also a prehistory that's a bit darker than I could have wished for, but perhaps also more realistic. So as I say here, history happened not always to ways of our liking. But that's how science is. We have to follow it until new evidence appears. And we are the result of that in Europe. This is the genetic mix of modern Europeans. And here we have the steppe from the migrations from the steppe in the 3rd millennium. Here we have the Neolithic. In Northern Europe, very little is left, more in the Mediterranean. And here we have our hunter-gatherer genetic heritage. That balance of genetic admixture was created in the 3rd millennium. It's still with us. So, in a way, there are genetic links between past and present. But that doesn't mean that the histories are the same. Transformation has changed societies fundamentally. And also, today, there are many people who want to create fake news or invent history to serve political and ideological purposes. We have to be incredibly careful when we communicate our new results. We put a lot of effort into our press releases. We try to control them as long as we can. When we came out with our Cell paper, after 3 days it had appeared in more than 100 media globally, the news of the plague. This is something that really hits in the media. It's wonderful. I mean, when were we last publishing in Nature and Science and Cell? When were our stories last brought out to 100 media globally in 3 days? It's fantastic, but it also put a lot of responsibility on our shoulders, the way we communicate. And some of the people like Eske Willerslev or Svante Pääbo, they become heroes in a way. A new form of academic heroes, because they become so popular. There are written popular books about them, or they write them themselves. There are books like Kind Boys we have heard about here. A huge bestseller you can buy in airports, or could, translated into 13 languages. Or Svante Pääbo's book, he was very proud, he told me, his was translated into 16 languages. So he felt he did a little better, and now more recently, Reich, who also got in trouble because of some of the things he wrote there, actually. So we are here on sensitive political and ideological ground. We should not abstain from following our search for the truth, but we should be careful and sensitive to the way we present it. So basically, we cannot prevent political misuse. There are people who want to do it, and they have done it. Humanities, history, and archaeology has been used for political purpose since the beginning. So the only way forward from the left and right, the only forward is to do good science and to do good popularization. And then we should welcome debate. That's also why I welcome that we will have second opinions here, and third. And Martin here has written, and with a lot of comments here, but there have been others as well. We have a debate going on. This is very important. The last word has never been said in science. So the two cultures, as we started out with, you can always discuss how far apart are they? What are their languages? Can they really work together? Yes, they can, because I've been doing it. We have been doing it for nearly 10 years. I've been doing it since I was a student, first with plant botanists and now with geneticists. It takes some effort from both sides. You must, invest some extra labor in understanding the other disciplines' methodology to be able to make good discussions. And geneticists must know a little bit about archaeology so we can discuss, and that's what we do. Not all our colleagues are willing to do that. Some come out with criticism without really knowing what they're talking about. But on the whole, people engaged and at least a number of people are willing to do that extra work. It demands extra work to do good interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research. There's no way around it. It's not easy, but it's well worth it. It's great fun. So we have been, and in a way, as I write here, I don't know if I do that actually, but the two sciences, archaeology and here DNA, in a way, it's part of an impossible marriage, or it's a love child of an impossible romance between Enlightenment and Romanticism. It's been going on since the 18th century Enlightenment. And there's been ups and downs in that love affair. There's been period where humanity said, no, we don't want you in science. And there have been periods where they have embraced them. These are the science revolution I talked about. But it has been like a cycle going up and down, which has been governed just as much by ideology of the present than by science. So it's a complex world that puts high demands, but that's part of the fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to comment on this talk by Kristian. First of all, I want to state that I am, just like Kristian, very much excited about this kind of aDNA revolution that we have had in archaeology, which is surely one of the greatest impacts that it has had on the archaeological science as long as I can think. So it has given us a fundamentally new data source. We have now the possibility to look at the biological connections between humans, between animals, between pathogens, and between a lot of other things that probably will come in the next few years, probably. And this allows us as archaeologists who are interested in historical, social processes to ground our models of social change on a vastly expanded pool of data. But then, of course, as Kristian also have been talking about, there have been problems. There have been especially problems when it comes into the integration of these kind of different data sets, the archaeological data sets with the biological data sets, and also how we implement this in a model that is somehow representing the anthropological knowledge on historical or on social processes. And I would say that a lot of this has to do with a kind of lack of sophistication when it comes to the implementation of the kind of archaeological and anthropological theory to this rather, I wouldn't say straightforward, but a little more clearly, objectivized natural scientific data. So I want to concentrate more on the issues, on these conceptual issues that have to do with the integration into of these different data sets. And I would surely say that Kristian is at the forefront of this kind of effort to somehow better integrate these different data sources. I will concentrate a lot of what I say on this middle part of his talk, where it was about the third millennium, this kind of pastoral migration into Europe, where he has, in my opinion, provided probably the best model, not probably the best model that is out there with this kind of scheme that we've seen here. He has put forward a coherent, anthropologically informed model of social change, of migration, that is a very well explicitly made starting point, which then allows for constructive critical discussion, which I want to do in the few minutes that I have here. I want to criticize several points that are connected to this. First of all, conceptual premises, which are a problem in the whole aDNA archaeology debate. Then I will discuss some of the underlying data that can be interpreted in different ways. And I will go into some issues of simplification, which I find problematic, although simplification as such is, of course, not a problematic thing at all. And I will look into some biases that I find are also underlying this kind of models. To start with the conceptual premises, I want to go back one step, especially also for the non-archaeologists here, and also somewhat just to remind people why migration as an explanatory framework was so much out of fashion before aDNA came and brought it back. It was not only a kind of small-mindedness of archaeologists, but it had to do with an association of the idea of migration with a very crude form of archaeology. It's what we call the culture historical archaeology in the early part of the 20th century, which then was also associated with the Nazi ideology and all these things. This culture historical archaeology was building upon a concept, the concept of the archaeological culture, that is basically here our units of classification, the Yamnaya, the Cordetware that we've heard about, that were at that time more or less seen as if they would represent prehistoric peoples. So a group of people which is culturally and biologically homogeneous, as a kind of ethnic group, as a group of like a national state that is then collectively moving back and forth in Europe. And this was the kind of concept which was clearly modeled after the 19th century nation states that people thought were more or less the only possible way in which human beings would organize themselves in the form of these closed ethnic groups. And this idea has then by anthropologists been totally deconstructed during the 20th century, and we know from a lot of anthropological work that ethnic identities are basically subjective self-descriptions, they're historically changeable, they're not based on biological similarity, and they're also often not marked by a common set of material objects. So ethnic groups are not static, they are changeable, they're not culturally homogeneous, or not necessarily at least, and of course they are not acting in a collective manner. If you look towards agency, you have to go to the individual level of individual human beings. So because we have had all this elaboration of these concepts, it was a little disturbing for a lot of archaeologists. Then when the aDNA papers came into, or had its most effect, for example, in 2015, we have seen these papers, that these aDNA papers took these kind of archaeological cultures like Yamnaya and Cordetware and took them to represent biological populations, which was something that somehow looked like a kind of going back to this early 20th century situation. And then they took this kind of premise to create this rather simplified narrative of the Yamnaya people that migrate westwards, and there they constitute a new group of people, the Cordetware people. This was one issue, and the second issue was that, Kristian talked about it, the concept of migration that was implemented in these early papers was then also a kind of stereotypical mass migration concept, so the idea of a kind of collective, permanent, one-way move of a closed group of people from A to B. This is a kind of romantic legend. This is the kind of migration that we think about when we think about the migration period, but which in reality, if we look at the historical sources and anthropology, never happened in this simplified way. If we look into anthropology, they are using migration is a kind of summary term for a wide variety of different forms of human mobility. And unless you specify what kind of human movement you're actually talking about, the use of the term migration doesn't really mean much. And this is again where I think Kristiansen's and his colleagues' model is a huge step forward, because they actually did, as we have heard, specify what kind of movements we're actually talking about. So this narrative of groups of male Yamnaya warriors that are migrating westwards and are killing all the native men and taking all the native women and thus mixing to become a new Corded people. And it is, as we have seen, built on a set of different data, a pandemic that have been identified, the male-dominated migration pattern, an uptick in violence, and a reduction of male lineages. And while I think that these are all good arguments, I think it is also important, in order to get into a better understanding or more detailed understanding what we're actually talking about, also to have a more detailed discussion about these different data sources. So I don't want to take down this model, Kristian. I want to, in a way, look into the kind of data that we have, and I want to challenge them in order to probably get into a more detailed picture, which, for example, could involve a lot more regional, local variation in the different factors that you are talking about. So just to give a few hints here, with the identification of Yersinia pestis, so the plague pathogen, which, as a lot of colleagues from the biological sciences have stressed, not necessarily mean that we are dealing with a pandemic in the Neolithic age. In fact, it seems to be the case that we have only found this kind of pathogen in a very low percentage of Neolithic graves that have been sequenced, which actually means, or actually indicates, that it might not be as virulent as the kind of plague that we think about when we think about the medieval variants. So this is something that needs to be analyzed further, of course. The second point that is also, in a way, ambiguous, or could be more ambiguous, is the question of this kind of uptick of violence. These mass graves that you showed are impressive and interesting as such, but of course it is a kind of incidental evidence, and I think what we need a little more here is a kind of, a systematic view on the rates of violence as well as we can see them. And there are some works that have been done in this direction. Heidi Peter Röcher, for example, who have looked at the German evidence of violence, signs of violence on human bodies in burials. And what she could find is that there is, of course, a high degree of violence here in the third millennium. This would be Corded ware, but it's not something that is, in a way, out of the ordinary. So it wouldn't really justify this kind of genocidal scenario that comes out of your model in the way that you told it. And also this argument with the reduction of the Y chromosome haplogroups is, as you said, and you showed this diagram here, clearly a global phenomenon. So it's actually then hard to use this kind of argument to explain something that specifically happened in the third millennium in Europe. So, I mean, as such, it is an interesting phenomenon, but it is nothing that, in my opinion, really helps us to understand the specifics of the third millennium in Europe. Okay, and then the question of the male-dominated migration pattern. Also there is a little more discussion among geneticists about the validity of this assessment. We have talked about it just before. In general, I don't really doubt it so much, because the archaeology actually confirms this kind of focus on male burials in this period, so probably this is not such a good argument. The biggest issue that I personally have had with your model from the beginning is an issue of simplification. Although I think that simplification is, of course, the essence of modeling, that's clear, but what I find a little disturbing, or not, it's not disturbing, but I think where it needs improvement is the idea that you have this kind of one phenomenon, or this one process with which you explain everything that happens in the third millennium. You explain the Corded ware, the bell beaker archaeological material, which, in my opinion at least, if you look at the material, is very much more varied, regionally varied, all over Europe. So it would, of course, benefit, I think, with a little more regional differentiation, allowing for different scenarios going on in different places. The same is true when it comes to the use of anthropological models, like, for example, something that features here in this model is the patrilocal exogamous marriage system, as it's somehow portrayed as being the most important, or maybe the main cultural phenomenon that is going on here. And of course it is valid, and the data also is confirming it. I will show here one example. We have in southern Germany, there was a group around Philipp Stockhammer, who was working in the Lech Valley in southern Germany, looking at burials from the 3rd millennium. And what they found here with their strontium isotope patterns, here the males, here the females, was that there are many more non-local women than men, something which is interpreted as a female exogamy patrilocal marriage system or something like this. However, if you take this and you remain here as this being the only cultural phenomenon you are pointing to, you are missing a lot of other important information about this site. For example, you don't explain what is going on with the non-local men, and you don't explain the fact, which is actually quite significant, that looking at the genetics, these non-local women actually do not have any offspring that is buried on this place. So there must at least be something else going on, for example, the exchange of children or some other cultural phenomenon that we could also combine with these non-local women. And I also want to demonstrate something here with a second example from this period. This is a burial mound, a typical Yamnaya flat burial mound from Hungary, where there is a sequence of burials starting with a local woman, and then later there is a sequence of secondary burials by males who are non-local from their isotopic signal, who also buried in the Yamnaya style, and thus they are interpreted as Yamnaya migrants. And I think it is significant that in all the literature that I've seen, it is never even discussed if we are dealing here, for example, with a model of male exogamy, like a matrilocal marriage system. It seems that this is something that cannot be because it is not somehow part of the overall narrative. And thus, I think we are dealing here with some kind of bias that is underlying the model and has to do with this kind of idea that you will have one process that explains the whole phenomenon, and thus it is hard to accept that there are different things going on different places. And thus you have here in the overall model a gender bias. Non-local men are migrants, they are the conquerors, and the non-local women, they are a sign of a patrilocal mating system, so the women are being handed around. So they have basically no agency on their own. This is one bias which I find a little problematic, and I think it's easily solvable by just focusing a little more on the role of women in these societies. And the second bias that I think is problematic is what I've already talked about, somehow the idea that you have these two different groups of people, these ethnicities of the Yamnaya warriors with specific cultural identities and specific ways of acting, and then the Kordotwe people as another one. This is something, I mean, Yamnaya and Kordotwe are terms created by archaeologists, names for specific burial customs. And it is important here that this is specific burial customs that also provide good preservation of bones, and thus they are providing a good source for aDNA sampling. And this is, okay, this doesn't pose a large problem, but I think it does pose a problem when you then take this kind of sample, so Yamnaya as a sample, an archaeologically available sample of probably a huge variety of people living on the steppes, and then you create these people because they have a specific burial ritual, you create them as being one specific group of people with a specific biology and a specific cultural identity who do specific things in Europe. This is dangerous, I think, because it really has political implications. You went into this, Kristian, in the end. It is a biologization of social identities, something that has been long overcome by social science, and something that is also not really anymore part of at least our humanistic way of looking at societies. To biologize social identities is to imply that throughout human history, from the beginning, there have been biologically defined cultures. This would be, if it is, I mean, it leads people to believe, when we archaeologists construct these things and put them in the prehistory, it looks as if these right-wing persons who think that we are living here in a kind of period where there are people with different qualities because of their biology, and they are having a culture clash and they are extinguishing each other. This is something that really feeds into ideologies that I think we should not support. So yes, it is a new prehistory that we may not like. I would go further and say that the kind of model that's being made here, so the idea of biologically determined social groups fighting each other, the absence of individual agency in the overall model, and also the subordination of women under men, this is actually not only a prehistory that we may not like, it is a view of human nature, a political ideology that we should not support. I will sum up now. I think my time is up also. All in all, definitely what I wanted to show here is that the integration of DNA and social theory that we are interested in archaeology, it started out on a wrong foot. But Kristian, you have surely been one of the persons who have best helped to steer the discourse into the right direction. I mean, I wouldn't take any of this away. You highlight social processes, you use anthropological knowledge. And I think especially when we look at the third millennium, your model is a good starting point, but it is clear that it shouldn't be seen as a kind of final narrative. I don't think you do that either. It needs to be open to critique of some of the empirical data. It needs to be, especially, I think, open for more regional, local variation. And of course, it could benefit from a broader array of anthropological models to explain what is actually going on. And definitely, I think there is no need for these biologized Jamnaya call it where peoples. They're actually not necessary at all for this model. It functions very well without. Thank you.
Migrate again and chose then to migrate to the country resembling New Zealand the most, which is Norway. And they have been in Norway since 2008, where they have been both establishing themselves as researchers. And now Bastiaan, together with his wife, is running the first Norwegian ancient DNA lab at the University of Oslo. And because of strong competition, they concentrate on other DNA than human DNA. We will hear more about that, I think, now.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to be here, and thank you for your kind introduction. So, as you already heard, indeed, my focus lies actually not on ancient DNA of humans. I predominantly work with different species, different animals, and for us, and therefore also the stories that we're working on and the questions that we ask are slightly different from the human ancient DNA field. So I would like to talk a bit about what makes this ancient DNA technology so prevalent these last couple of years, and what can we do with this, and what sort of technological advances underlie the huge revolution, as you've just heard, and how we can assess the past. As a proper ancient DNA person, we have a Twitter account. Almost all ancient DNA people have Twitter accounts, so we're now following suit. And I would like to stress that for me, ancient DNA is much more than human ancient DNA. What we're really interested in is understanding the past from a variety of species. And for us, ancient samples are fantastic because these provide a window of opportunity to look into the past before humans have had a massive impact on the natural world, or so we think. So what I would like to stress is that you can get ancient DNA from herbarium. herbarium specimens, they're on the top right. You can get it from different kinds of biological sample, and you can get it even from sedimentary ancient DNA. And for a biologist, this is fantastic material, especially, for example, from the sedimentary ancient DNA. If these are nicely layered sediment layers, we can really try to better understand the past distribution of species and animals, and in that sense understand, for example, things like climate change or human impacts on particular species distributions. And this is, for us as biologists, a fascinating tool. And we're still learning about what we can do with ancient DNA, and we're still learning about samples that we can actually use. And I just wanted to highlight, for me, a fascinating example that was just recently published, and there is Per here in the room, he knows more about this as well, is how people got ancient DNA out of old birch sap chewing gums that were up to 10,000 years old. And in that sense, you're basically looking at the persons who chewed that stuff 10,000 years ago. I find that a fascinating source of ancient DNA forensics that for me was still mind-blowing. In my work, I do work regularly with archaeologists, and I do like to think that we work well with archaeologists. But for me, I'm going to talk to my archaeology friend and say that the work that we do together frees up their intellectual property. I find that, thank you, I'm taking that away from this evening in any case. So I just like to stress the phenomenal technological advances that have only recently really knocked through the biological sciences. What you see here is a graph with a couple of dates, only up to 2017. And what you see here on the right is Moore's law. And Moore's law comes actually from the computational sciences, and it represents a doubling of the amount of chips that we have every roughly 2 years. And in that sense, this is a straight line, but it's actually an exponential line. And it's the line that has made sure that the telephone that you're carrying right now in your pocket has more power than any computer that you could buy as a consumer in the 90s, for example. So it goes extremely fast. What we see here then is an even faster drop in sequencing costs. Right? And this is beyond the exponential. And this means that we completely change the way that we can analyze and obtain our data. So, for example, I myself was personally involved in the sequencing of the Atlantic cod genome. That was a Norwegian effort. It was in 2011. When we did this, this was a project that we worked on with several postdocs, a couple of PhDs, and it took us several years, and then in the end we published this in Nature, which was a great result. What we do now, we've just got a PhD who's doing a similar type of project on his own. It's going to be a chapter in his thesis, we hope published in Nature, but we probably won't manage. And we do this off a Nansen grant, okay? So this is just 5 years. It's a complete change of what we do. It's a complete change in how we can work. And this has been the major driver in what we can do and obtain data in the ancient DNA world. And because there you need a lot of sequencing. Okay? So another reason why ancient DNA, and especially mammalian ancient DNA, has been so successful and reproducible the last couple of years is by finding out that we need to select the right type of biological material. And that is found in 2014 already. What you see here is a comparison, it's working, per individual sample of a bone called the petrosal bone, the petrous bone. And this is a bone that sits inside the mammalian skull. It's a tiny bone. And that bone carries a lot more endogenous DNA than any type of other bone in the human or mammalian body. And this is a game changer, because suddenly, rather than having very little endogenous DNA, and endogenous DNA is the DNA of the specimen that you're interested in, and not some sort of DNA of the microbials or whatever it is that you can find in your ancient sample, that completely changes how we can actually obtain DNA. And that completely changes, but also puts a lot of pressure on these type of sample, because with these type of sample, you can answer specific questions that you cannot do with other samples. And we know this from ourselves as well. So we're working, for example, on ancient sheep samples, and what you see here is a list of samples here on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, you see the amount of endogenous DNA. And what you can see here, most of these samples are petrous bone. And what you can see here is that most of our samples have some DNA, and a large number of them also have a high amount of DNA. Okay, so this means that most of these samples, we can do something with it. For example, 1/3 of these samples we have taken on to do deep sequencing and go further with. And this means This is actually really a change from the earlier ancient DNA world where we didn't know so much. And what we actually have to work with is a large screening data set where we have to screen hundreds of samples and only a few of them work. So this changes the way, again, how we obtain DNA. So this has led to a proliferation, and you've just seen a few of these examples here presented by Kristian, about how much, and this is still mind-boggling to me, how fast this has evolved as well. So just a few years ago, the number of ancient human genomes that were published is just a handful. It's just 1 or 2. And by now, we have data sets being published that contain hundreds, if not thousands, of ancient human genomes. And also of increasingly high quality as well, with more than what we biologists like to call 1x coverage, which means that you have screened all the bases in the genome at least once, on average. Okay? And this also has led, of course, to a complete change in the focus of these manuscripts. Initially, this was a lot of technological advancements. We sequenced the oldest genome in this part of the world, right? And what we see now is that there is coming on comparative population data sets containing hundreds of individuals, and in that sense also addressing some of Martin's concern as well, increasingly detailed hypotheses can be tested by more and more samples, okay? And this is just going to continue. So for me, still, it's a fascinating realization that from sometimes bones that you normally would, or that very little phenotypic or other kind of zooarchaeological measurements, you might be able to obtain DNA from such a bone, and that DNA is directly comparable to a wide range of modern algorithms that are exquisitely adaptable to those things. So all kinds of analysis that we like to do and that have been developed for modern DNA can be immediately transferred to ancient DNA with some certain some small limitations. But then with the greater advantage that these are spaced in time. So this really allows us then to address spatio-temporal questions in a way not seen before, and we've seen the example of that with Kristian's paper. Like I said, from a biological perspective, for us these samples are invaluable because they allow us to transfer back our biological knowledge from before human influence, and this is, of course, our biological interest as well. But I like to stress that what we've learned so far, and what we've been talking about so far, is mainly human only. And the applications that we see here indeed rely exquisitely on an excellent genome assembly, on extensive comparative reference data sets. And this is not available for all the species that we, or at least as a biologist, that I'm interested in. So mainly the story of ancient DNA so far has been regarding humans, as we've seen, or regarding domesticated species, for which also such tools are available. But I would like to say that if we want to work with a lot more species and better understand the biological work, we're going to need and we're going to get more of those genomic tools. Yeah. But I would also like to stress, and this is something that I find more and more in my work, and we've seen really fantastic examples here already, is that ancient DNA is not the golden bullet. It's just one of the tools available to understand the past. And we really need all kinds of inference, like stable isotope analysis. There's a whole range of different methods there. Certain kinds of dating, carbon dating, uranium dating, all of these aspects, population genetics, time series analysis, and then very importantly, if we do not understand the archaeological context of a sample, for a biologist, such a sample is immediately worth a lot less. We really need to work together with the archaeologist and to obtain the context. I can't do that. I can't even assess whether an excavation has been done properly or not. Historical context, that's not my expertise. I really need the other people around to really help make this project or make this multidisciplinary inference for the integration for the best inference. So for myself, and this was mentioned in the introduction, is we recently published a story on the trade of Atlantic walrus from Greenland. And this was a DNA-based study only, and I don't really want to go into details here because I have no time, but one of the findings was that we could trace the biological origin of hunted walruses in medieval Europe based on their DNA, but that this method was imperfect in that we could actually trace one variant with certainty, but the other variant we had to take some assumptions. And what we now have, and I can't show you these results, is that based on additional inference from stable isotopes and from zooarchaeology, we can create a much richer narrative about where these samples have come from, and in fact show that there has been which changes some of our assumptions and creates this richer narrative. So this is a story that we'll be submitting soon, and for me was a real eye-opener how stable isotopes can actually help the inference of the DNA world. So where do we go from here? So it's still a very young discipline from a biological perspective. This means that we're still going to see improved methodology. We're going to see more samples pop up. We're going to see better ways of dealing with these samples in the lab, and we're going to see more ancient DNA methodological approaches being developed as well. This is going to be a continuing thing for I don't know how long, and it's going to keep on. So, but I also think we're going to see more papers like the one Martin referred to and like the one Kristian referred to, where we see a greater integration of methods. It's not going to be just ancient DNA. I think it's going to be, especially for the human narrative, it's going to be an integration of methods where we're going to use multi-proxy inferences to really figure out what happens to these samples. How were these samples found? How were they actually, and what their diet was, for example. All kinds of integrative methods will certainly improve the inference here. Now, one of the things is that there was, of course, a discussion about the dominance of certain labs in the ancient DNA world, but by now many, many labs of ancient DNA have been popping up. And this is, of course, also because all these dominant labs, they also produce postdocs that go up and go and make their own labs. And this is actually not the most recent one, because in Norway we have now 3 ancient DNA labs. So what I also would hope is that it's not rocket science, ancient DNA, and it should become increasingly available as a method for investigation for a wide range of archaeologists, and then you don't have to go to these dominant labs because they're the only player in the world. And I think in that sense it would also allow for a much larger democratization of ancient DNA. Whether it's going to become even more laboratories or not, I don't know, but there is already quite a few out there. What I also think is that there is a real emphasis on obtaining more reference genomes. So like projects like the Genome 10K that aims to sequence 10,000 vertebrate genomes and invertebrate genomes, or even more ambitious, the Earth Biogenome Project, which aims to sequence all eukaryote life on Earth in a 10-year period, which, if they would only partly succeed, would mean a complete revolution of the sequencing industry again, because we currently don't have the infrastructure to even almost contemplate such efforts. But regardless whether this is going to go through or not, such data will make more and more species available for archaeological inference and allows us then to target more and different questions. And then finally, I still think we're going to also see a further integration between the archaeological and biological sciences. At the moment, I'm part of an international training network, which is actually led by an archaeologist, whereby we really go and basically train a new breed of scientists that sits on the interface between these two disciplines, which I hope would help also create a better narrative between the two disciplines, because we do have different cultures. Biology is not archaeology. We do publish in different journals. We have different styles of writing. We have different styles of presenting. And like Kristian said, it's not easy to cross these disciplines. It requires effort from both sides. It requires longer work. The papers will go a bit slower because you have to really sit together and talk things through and appreciate each other from the different fields. Yeah, and with that, I'd like to thank you.